Up ahead of us is our small herd of cracker cattle. I mean, these are descendants from the original cattle that were brought over from the Spanish conquistadors back in the 1600s. They came over as cargo, and they were a fairly small animal that had good traits as far as being able to live without a lot of help, living off of the harsh habitat that was in Florida at the time.
Well, we're at the Southwest Florida Museum of History, and the exhibit we're in now is our agriculture exhibit. And we highlight the 3 C's of Florida agriculture, which is citrus, cattle, and cane. And those are the 3 big industries within agriculture that have really made Florida what it is today. Interestingly, all 3 of those were originally brought over by the Spanish in their first inhabitants here in Florida. The cattle in the first place was brought over as a food source for the settlement of Florida. And citrus and cane were later brought over as cash crops. Well, the cattle established itself as almost a native breed here in Florida. In fact, the early American settlers who came down here to herd the cattle, they were free roaming. And so the Florida cowboy, or what we call the Florida cracker, would herd the cattle once a year during season when they were bringing them to market. But other than that, they just kind of roamed the state. And so they adopted very well to our environment. The Florida scrub cattle that you see behind me here now was a species that was predominant here all the way up into the mid-1900s. And was very hardy. It was able to stand the cold in the wintertime, it was able to stand the heat and the humidity, obviously, that we have here, but also did very well in the swamps and out in the grasses and the sawgrass, and so it adapted very well to the Florida environment. When the United States purchased Florida from the Spanish, they started that transaction in 1819, completed it in 1821, and at that point the government was encouraging people to settle Florida. And one of the main draws for Florida was to come down here and capture these free roaming cattle and use that as a monetary source and as a business. And so that industry really started in the early 1800s, built all the way through the Civil War, and then became a very important issue during the Civil War. It was the Civil War period that really put this area on the map. The fort was built during the Seminole War, but also served during the Civil War, and the cattle industry was the reason for the fort being here. Although Florida was a Confederate state, the fort was a Union fort, and so it was established by Union soldiers and was used to actually go out and steal cows. And so the soldiers would go out and round up the cattle, they'd put them on boats, and they'd ship them down to Cuba and sell them to the Spanish. Raising money, obviously, for the Northern War effort, but more importantly, cutting off a major source of food for the Confederate Army. Interestingly enough, the local cattlemen, in many cases, were also taking those cattle and shipping them down to the Cubans and selling them. So why were they doing that? Well, the big issue was the Confederacy was paying with Confederate dollars, which were basically worthless. The Spanish were paying gold. And so there was a lot of smuggling of cattle going on here, and it was those people that were involved in that industry that after the Civil War picked up and really saw the cattle industry just boom in the 1880s and all the way through modern day. In 1885, when Thomas Edison arrived, there were 349 people in Fort Myers. And most of those people were here in one way or another around the cattle industry, whether they were part of the cattle industry themselves or they were part of the cattle trade. So Fort Myers had a post office, so it was a stopping point for the crackers as they were driving their cattle. It was along the road, the cattle trail, from the inland where the cattle were roaming to Punta Rassa, where a man named Jacob Summerlin, who's known as the king of the crackers, set up his trading post for Southwest Florida. Well, Jacob Summerlin was one of the largest cattle owners in the whole state. You'll find his name stretching most of the peninsula as far as areas that he owned and land that he controlled. Here in Southwest Florida, he was by far the largest cattle owner and set up the the Summerlin trading post down in Punta Rassa. So today, where you go across the causeway to get to Sanibel, that was a major trading post for cattle for all of Southwest Florida. And what you have to realize is that at this time, that was the only way to get cows out of Southwest Florida, get anything out of Southwest Florida. There wasn't a road system to go north through the land. Particularly during the wet season, it was almost impassable to take the land route up to other trading posts. So they'd be loaded onto boats and either shipped south to Cuba and sold to the Spanish, or shipped up north where they could eventually end up in the Mississippi River through New Orleans and end up anywhere. Well, Fort Myers was a cow town in the 1880s. The change started really in 1884-85, and a few things were happening during that period of time. One, Thomas Edison was starting to visit Fort Myers. He first came in the winter of 84-85. What was the importance of that? Well, he was telling the world about Fort Myers, really. He was a great marketer for Fort Myers in him being down here. And so his friends started to come down. In addition, at that same time, a whole nother industry was beginning, and that was the fishing industry. And they started to catch tarpon out in the Boca Grande Pass and in the waters around Sanibel. And so people started to want to come down to Fort Myers, a different crowd, not crackers, not cowboys, but wealthy northerners were coming down and wanting to visit Fort Myers, whether it was for fishing or outdoors, or to come visit their friend Thomas Edison when he was here. And so the big change in population really happened in Fort Myers in 1904 when the railroad arrived.
Babcock Ranch is a 90,000 acre ranch in southwest Florida near Punta Gorda. It's owned partially by the state of Florida and partially by a company called Kitson and Partners that purchased the ranch 7 years ago and then sold part of it back to the state of Florida. We're a cow-calf operation. You know, our business is to sell calves. So we sell them at the point when it's the best for the calf and the most profitable for us. And then we'll keep some of the females to replenish the herd. The calves, when they're shipped in the summer, in July and August, they're shipped to the feed yards, generally out west. And the reason for that is that's where the feed yards and the processing plants are established. In the grain, most of the grain is grown out there in that part of the country. And it's cheaper to ship the calf to the grain out west than it is to ship the grain to Florida and try to raise a full-grown cow in Florida. The weather conditions, you know, it gets hot and rainy, and it's difficult. And it's hard to store grain in Florida because it's so hot and humid. We're close to 4,000 head, and it takes about 20 acres of this type of terrain to maintain a cow. So the majority of the ranch is utilized for the cattle operation, but not all of it at one time. They're rotated and moved around the ranch, so they graze an area for a while, and then we'll move them to another area and graze it. Our breeds they're mixed together. It's a mix of Brahma and Angus, generally what we call a Brangus cattle. The reason for that is the Angus is a high quality beef, where the Brahma is a more durable cow, and you mix the two, breed the two together, and then you have a cow that can live in the kind of harsh conditions in South Florida. You know, it's wet and hot and a lot of mosquitoes and that kind of thing. So to have a purebred Angus doesn't do as well down here. So you mix that Brahma in there with it to give it that kind of toughness and hardiness. The property was always managed, and when the Babcocks owned it, they managed it as a combination of timber, cattle, and native natural habitat. They enjoyed hunting on it and promoted wildlife habitat, and that was part of what the state of Florida's attraction to it was that it was still a pristine ranch, even though it's a working cattle ranch. It was never worked heavy towards any one direction. It wasn't specifically just for cattle or just for timber or just for wildlife habitat. It was always kept balanced among the three. A lot of people think of Florida as either the beach or the mouse, and that's really about the only two things they know about. And most people that come out here, the first thing they say is, I didn't know this was out here, even though they live 45 minutes away. As an ag producer, I always feel like it's important for people to know where their food comes from, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing with folks, whether it's vegetables or beef or whatever. That it doesn't just come from the supermarket, that you know, there's people out here working and producing those products, and it takes a lot of work, a lot of risk. And there's a lot of similarities between now and years ago. I mean, the cow's a cow, the calf's a calf, you know. I mean, you still gotta raise it and load it and ship it.